let me start recording. So we'll kick it off with a quick introduction. We'll talk a little bit about the purpose behind these events, as well as some background on Skagit and Whatcom Land Trust. Then we'll have Kirk Troberg of DNR speak about wildfire risk areas and response measures taken during wildfire events. Nick Kunz of the Skagit Conservation District will give us some background on forest ecology and fire ecology in Western Washington. And our last presentation will feature Jenny Coe of the Whatcom and Skagit Conservation Districts, and she'll be speaking about wildfire preparedness for homeowners. And finally, we'll have about 10, 15 minutes, hopefully 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session before wrapping up and sending you all on your way to enjoy the rest of your evenings. First, a little bit of background on Skagit and Whatcom Land Trust. So Skagit Land Trust was founded in 1992, protects nearly 9,000 acres in Skagit County. We have 45 conservation areas that we own in fee simple and 40 conservation easements, which are like partnerships with private landowners. And our mission is to conserve wildlife habitat, agricultural and forest lands, scenic open space, wetlands, and shorelines for the benefit of our community and as a legacy for future generations. So I'd like to kick it over to Abby with Whatcom Land Trust now.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby. I'm Whatcom Land Trust volunteer coordinator. I want to tell you a little bit about Whatcom Land Trust. Whatcom Land Trust was founded in 1984 and has since protected nearly 15,700 acres with 100 owned properties and about 105 conservation easements with private landowners. This includes forests, wetlands, shorelines, and farmlands. We, in partnership with Whatcom County, we protect farmland throughout the county and keep that land in agriculture. We additionally have conservation easements on Whatcom County Park properties. This training is really relevant because we're working through managing all of our forests for not only sustainable wildlife habitat, but also for fire risk. So thanks, Jonathan, for letting us be part of it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Abby. And it's been really great for the Skagit Land Trust to work with Whatcom Land Trust and the folks at the conservation districts and DNR on this event. We really wanted to host this webinar because in many places, we see wildfire risk increasing over time as the climate changes. And while much of Western Washington may not have experienced or felt this yet, we want to help folks be prepared if and when that does occur in the future. And this is a topic that we often get questions about from our conservation easement landowners and volunteers. And we really want to make sure that folks with those questions receive high quality information from experts like the ones that you'll hear from tonight. And I also want to note for our conservation easement landowners on the call tonight that the home fireproofing actions that we hear about from Jenny are general advice for landowners. And if you're interested in implementing these on your property, make sure to talk to Regina, our stewardship director, or review the terms of your easement before doing that. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Our first presentation tonight will be from Kirk Troberg. He's the Colchian Unit Fire Manager for the Northwest region of the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Kirk was born and raised in Colville, Washington. He started his career working in the Colville National Forest from 2007 to 2009. At that point, he was a student at Western Washington University and got tired of traveling home every summer for work. So in 2010, he was hired by Northwest Region DNR as a seasonal firefighter and engine boss. In 2014, he was hired permanently into the timber sales program. And in 2015, he switched to a position that spent the summer in the fire program and the winter working in forest practices. In 2020, he transferred full-time to the fire program and has been the Colchian unit manager for the last few years. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Kirk, take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, as Jonathan said, I'm Kirk Troberg. Sorry, I had to find my camera. I'm the Colchian Unit Fire Manager, and the Colchian Unit is the geographic breakout of Whatcom and Skagit County for the Department of Natural Resources. So it's 100% of Whatcom and about 90% of Skagit. As for who the DNR is and what our role here is, we are the largest fire department in the state. The DNR has jurisdiction, or jurisdiction is the buzzword, but the real reality of it is responsibility for fire suppression on all non-federal public. So, any state lands, tribal lands, county-owned lands, municipal forest lands, non-federal public, and all private forest land across the entire state of Washington. Now, in the wildland urban interface, our responsibility there, jurisdiction, often overlaps with your local fire department. So you'll see both of us should a fire show up. How that breaks out into wildfire, we've got, just in terms of resources, about 120 fire engines across the state, 9 helicopters, and 6 hand crews. In Skagit County, we've got 4 to 5 fire engines, depending on the day. There's a hand crew that's actually based out of Whatcom County, but is available for Skagit County, and then a helicopter out of Big Lake Fire Department in the summer. So they'll be online in about 3 weeks. Now, at any given point, it's important that people understand, right? Fires happen. So some of those resources may be busy. And in fact, we sent some folks to New Mexico recently and are likely to send more. So all could be available or none. Well, not none. There's always someone available, but the response could be affected by what's going on if there's more than one fire around. Now, as far as our approach to wildfire risk and the assessment work that we've done in conjunction with the conservation districts, it's all really kind of focused on the survivability of the structure itself. And we use kind of the Firewise USA program is the main one that we use as a template to get there. And Jenny and Nick will help put that in some context in their presentations, I'm sure. But the big overarching theme is that we don't want to eliminate fire from the landscape when we're talking about risk. It's not about removing fire altogether. Fire is an important part of the ecosystem. It serves an important ecological function. So what we're trying to do is keep it low intensity and manageable should it occur, so we can come in and deal with it, and your house is going to be saved. And just from a purely conceptual approach point, the reason this is so important in places like Skagit County, even though we don't usually have the big mega fires that you see on TV or on the news in Skagit County, it's important because you can have low risk conditions 363 days a year and have 2 days, maybe a day in July and a day in August, where the weather lines up and you just have really high risk conditions. And that could be all it takes. A fire doesn't have to be 100,000 acres to burn down your house. A little bit of damage or a lot of damage can be done in a little bit of time. So that's why wildfire awareness and risk awareness is so important. And that's kind of the approach we take. Yeah, I think that's more or less what I've got. Sorry, I kind of rambled through that pretty quick, but I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Kirk. I'll go ahead and share my screen again here. So next, and yeah, as Kirk mentioned, I'm sure we'll have questions popping up throughout. Again, feel free to put those in the chat. And we'll hold those until the very end of the webinar tonight, just in case those questions end up getting answered in the next couple presentations. So don't worry about it if we don't stop and go over your question right away. Our next presentation will be from Nick Kunz. Nick is a forester for the Skagit Conservation District. Nick has been serving the Conservation District since April 2021 and works with Jenny, our next presenter, on wildfire assessments, planning, and education. Over the last 10 years, Nick has served in roles as statewide liaison for water quality agency regulatory programs and forestry and forest restoration grants, consulting forester, wetland assessment and delineation, and geographic information systems, and tribal regeneration forester. In addition to wildfire preparedness, he offers a wide array of forestry services, from technical and financial assistance to education and outreach to forest landowners throughout Skagit County. He holds a bachelor's degree from California Polytechnic State University in forestry and natural resources with a concentration in geology. All right, Nick, I'll stop sharing my screen and you can go ahead and begin.
Great. Thank you. Let me pull up the presentation here. Everyone can hear me fine? Good. All right. Yeah, so I'll be going over some forest health and fire ecology. The two are linked, and I'll explain how that process works and a little bit of terminology to get into to start with forest health. And I'll just preface that there is no universally accepted definition. However, there are some, I feel, some better definitions here. And this one comes from the Dictionary of Forestry. It's a perceived condition of forest derived from concerns about factors, age, structure, presence, unusual levels of insect and disease. That's probably where the nuance comes in, and resilience to disturbance. I'm sure most folks have heard that term applied to forest ecosystems. And the interpretation is determined and influenced by a whole number of factors. And I'm going to cover some of those and also the cultural viewpoints, land management objectives, of course, and then the scales. So real briefly, the process of assessing forest health encompasses really 4 key factors. Signs, that's what you see from the actual agent that is causing a forest health concern. You've got symptoms, that's what the host or the tree expresses, or other vegetation. And then of course you've got patterns across space and time, and context. That's the landscape features, the history of disturbance, everything from weather to volcanoes to fire, of course. And a good reference for folks here, this was recently updated in 2021, the Field Guide to Common Diseases and Insects. I highly recommend, if folks want to dive into the actual diagnostic flow and also some of the insect and disease specific signs and symptoms. This manual is an excellent resource for conifers. There isn't a similar or analogous one for hardwoods, but I'll direct folks to some other resources that towards the end here. And so, as I mentioned, the interaction between pests and disease often affect larger areas, but they're not seen as much of a concern. Fire is more immediate. It threatens people's homes and livelihoods. Certainly, we all have felt the smoke. I'm sure some of you folks who have been around remember the summer of 2018 was pretty hazy from the fires up in BC, and it's actually pretty common to have some of those winds blow a lot of smoke from elsewhere into the Puget Sound region. And so what you're seeing on the top graphic here are outlines of aerial detection surveys that are done annually by both Washington DNR and the U.S. Forest Service. And they represent areas that are over multiple years. This spans from roughly 1980 to 2019. And they represent various disturbance agents, various pests and disease that have visual indicator, those signs, and they're picked up by operators who observe them from an airplane. And so they map all of these polygons. Usually it happens, like I said, annually statewide. Last couple of years, because of COVID, they haven't been able to address most of Washington, but I believe this year they're going to be picking that back up. The graphic on the bottom here, is the fire incidents, and some of the larger polygons that you see here are the larger fires. And I'm going to show you where you can access this information on a live web map towards the end here. But as you can see, there's quite a bit more areas affected by forest health. And then if you think about tree mortality, how that can add fuel to the fire, literally, it increases the risk. It often sets the stage for more severe wildfire. And of course, in the background or the context of a lot of this pest and disease are the climate. And what you're seeing on the top graphic is an outline of an area and the Palmer Drought Severity Index over the last, looks like 40, 50 years. We can see some of the changes in the frequency of drought, and of course the severity in the, looks like the mid 90s, and then also early 2000s. And of course the most recent and severe drought in 2015, it's suspected that that kicked off a lot of tree mortality. And one of the tools that we use to kind of look back in time, you see the graphic below, is actually a core sample that I recently took out at the Cumberland Preserve. And there's a number of areas that that line up with some of these drought scenarios. So they can be, tree rings can be an indicator of stress and reduced growth. And eventually some of trees can succumb to other pests when they're stressed. So some keys to managing forest health: early detection. Of course, in the home ignition zone is pretty easy, but sometimes it's a little bit farther than that. Accurate identification of the biological, abiotic agents. Understanding the pest and disease cycles. We often see a rise and then a quick crash or collapse of certain pest infestations. And so those have sort of a cyclical nature, but of course we're concerned is that with an extended dry period, we could actually see an increase in frequency in some of these disease and pest cycles. And of course, there's a complex interaction. Sometimes it's, well, often it's never one issue. A tree can be hit with basically a 1, 2, or even 3 punch from a fungus, from a pest, a wood borer, and then of course, drought stress. And so really the key is to have a plan, how you might go about addressing it. There are a number of tools, and a few of them are using appropriate seed sources. The graphic you see here, very stressed Doug fir. And while I can't confirm this, I do know that the signs or symptoms were consistent with Swiss needle cast. And a lot of times material is moved around, and so we can actually induce some of these mortality or tree mortality issues by moving seed sources around. And so it becomes kind of a tricky proposition, especially when there's additional pressures from other pests and disease. Managing the density and the species composition. For instance, we know that the white pine blister rust often has part of its life cycle hosted on ribes, so that's currants and so forth. And so having ready stock of ribes plants with your white pine might be an additional risk. So you want to consider some of the species composition. And I think the biggest one really is soil moisture. And there's a number of techniques to increase your soil moisture, retaining coarse woody debris and so forth. Some of the resources for these forest health concerns: Washington State University has a plant pathology center down in Puyallup, and they're addressing a number of emerging issues: western cedar dieback, sword fern die-off, bigleaf maple issues, both the dieback and the sooty bark disease. And there's actually a citizen science webpage. Folks can get involved and see where these problems are persisting through the Forest Health Watch. And then annually, DNR and the U.S. Forest Service publish what's called the Forest Health Highlights. And a lot of this information comes from the aerial detection surveys that I mentioned earlier. but also the ground truthing and some of the groundwork that these agencies do to verify what they're seeing from the air. So now I'm going to kind of transition into the role of fire here. And one of the key terms in fire ecology is a fire regime. And it's a generalized description of the role fire plays in the ecosystem. There's a number of components: frequency, extent, intensity or severity, and seasonality. Now, some folks question, well, what's the difference between intensity versus severity? Intensity has to do with the rate in which fire spreads across the landscape. So often this is what firefighters, they experience in real time. Severity often deals with the after effects, how far the wildfire spread, or how far or how deep it went into the soil layers. And of course, on the west side, fire regimes range. We have everything from frequent low severity to infrequent and high severity. Folks that are maybe new to Washington, back around the early 1900s, one of the largest fires in Washington, the Yakult fire, burned nearly 500,000 acres. Now, it didn't burn that much in one season, but there was actually a reburn a few years later, and the fire effects are still observable today. So if anyone wants to see what a very large fire in Western Washington looks like many years later, you can certainly visit the Yakult fire area. And some of the frequent low severity fires actually been observed or studied out on the San Juan Islands. There's a recent paper out, Jonathan Bakar et al. Looked at fire scars on trees and hypothesized or determined that there was actually more frequent fire than what we experience there today. And of course, there's a cultural component. This is less understood because a lot of the cultural burning that occurred was stopped or prohibited. And the picture you're seeing down on the lower left here is a place called Moses Creek. It's out on the Quinault Reservation, and the tribal fire staff, and I believe a number of other agencies, the Nature Conservancy, were involved in reestablishing some kind of fire on this landscape because it was culturally important for a variety of reasons. They utilized this area for hunting grounds, but also for camas and other plants. And often what these cultural burns represented were learning opportunities for the next generation to begin to understand the role of fire, even out on a place like the Quinault, which receives quite a bit of rainfall. It's still an important practice, and there are a number of tribes in Western Washington that are reestablishing that relationship with fire. The reference, or the book on the lower right-hand side, Forgotten Fires, an excellent overview of wildfire throughout North America. It's quite a controversial book when it came out, but it does provide some insight into the variety of uses and the timing and the application of fire across the landscape. So with historical fire regimes, as determined by fire scar analysis, lacustrine sediments, and more frequently soil char sampling, they inform us about past regimes under a variety of climates. We can go particularly with lacustrine sediments, we can go back quite a ways, thousands of years, and get some kind of idea of what the fire regimes were in the past. However, With a changing climate, and of course, the vegetation composition, distribution, all the changes that we've had on the landscape, that's quite a different scenario than what we have now. And of course, the built environment is orders of magnitude larger and makes things much more complicated. Some recent research for folks that want to dive a little bit more into this topic of how climate is going to change. Highly recommend this 2020 paper by Hevlovsky et al. And then there's a reassessment going on of West Side fire regimes through the U.S. Forests Pacific Northwest Research Station, West Side Fire and Climate Adaptation Research Initiative. They're supposed to be coming out with papers here shortly, or they do have some already, but I would definitely stay tuned to the research coming out of there. And then the UW's Flame Lab is looking at a number of factors like the effectiveness of certain fuel treatments. Of course, the smoke concerns are ever present. And so the Flame Lab has a number of projects and initiatives going on to address those issues. And closer to home, we have a web application where folks can go online and they can actually zoom into their locale, and they can look at a number of factors that I've covered here, everything from drought to high-risk soils. Those are soils that don't have a lot of available water for plants. Some historical information, burn severity from past fires, and so forth. And I'm going to attempt a quick little demo here for folks to see. Hopefully I can share a different screen here. So folks can see the web application here. So we have current fire weather outlooks. It's usually from, they have in the next 3 days and beyond through the National Weather Service. And we also have the Forest Health Survey information that you can actually, you can turn on those layers. And one of the features that I have added here is the ability to bring in your own boundary layers, if you will, or your own ownership. And for this exercise, I just brought in Skagit Land Trust provided a boundary of some of their properties. I'm going to turn off. So you can see the boundary layers for their ownership are highlighted here in purple. And so there's a whole slew of other layers. I won't get into too much detail, but I do have a lot of DNR's current fire locations, industrial fire precaution levels, and then also this land fire tab allows folks to go in and actually look at the fire regime in their vicinity. So I'm going to bounce back to my presentation here. So this is a tool that we offer off of our website. I'm available if folks want some more detail or help navigating there. And this can help with various planning efforts. And for those folks who aren't aware, in 2019, the Skagit Conservation District with Jenny Coe and also Al Craney, former forester, helped put together a risk analysis. And we've recently recorded a YouTube video describing that process and what that entails. Some of the layers that were developed, the spatial layers that you saw in the previous tool are discussed in this presentation. And then I included this reference to After the Burn, which is a nice little concise manual on how to do some post-fire assessment. Part of your planning or your thought process can delve into what would you do in the event that you did experience a fire and you did want to replant, so forth. Kind of helps walk through the assessment process for which trees are likely to succumb to fire damage. So I'm not going to take any questions, but I always like to include this slide. Anyone here know where this photo was taken and how it was created? Sorry, little pop quiz at the end. Anybody?
If anyone knows, feel free to unmute yourself and give an answer. I have no clue.
All right, I'll give it away. So this is down, I believe, in Clackamas County. It's on Hampton lumber land, and the foresters got a little creative here, and they planted Western larch in this configuration. So of course, we know Western larch drops its needles in the fall, and that's how you get the smiley face on the hill. So with that, I'm gonna stop.
That's good. That's funny, Nick. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for that presentation. That was really informative, especially showing off that web app. That's pretty cool. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to our last presentation now. Our last presenter is going to be Jenny Coe. She is the Community Wildfire Resilience Coordinator for the Whatcom and Skagit Conservation Districts. Jenny has been serving conservation districts in Washington State since 2001 and working with communities and partners on wildfire preparedness in the Pacific Northwest for 17 years. She currently coordinates the Community Wildfire Resilience Program for both Whatcom and Skagit Conservation Districts. Jenny splits her time between working one-on-one with landowners and neighborhood groups on wildfire preparedness and working at the planning scale with local, state, and federal partners to assess risk and create collaboration opportunities in her region. She has a degree from the Huxley College in the Environment at Western Washington University. All right, Jenny, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Great. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Jonathan and the Skagit Land Trust folks for putting this together, and for the other presenters. Nick, that was great. There are lots of great resources I think people might be interested in pursuing, including myself. So thank you for sharing that. So my presentation this evening is focused on what you as a homeowner or a resident can do to better prepare your property and your structures to survive wildfire. And I do a lot of work one-on-one with residents and with communities to work through this process of better understanding wildfire risk and what you can do about it. So, and I work both in Whatcom County and in Skagit County in this program. And I will talk more about services through the conservation districts at the end of my presentation. Oh, let's see, hold on a second. There we go. Okay, I like to start my presentation with this slide just because it kind of establishes what's going on in our area. When we talk a lot about wildfire, sometimes we're thinking about California and Montana and the other side of the mountains in our state, but not necessarily Western Washington. But through a lot of research that has been going on and is still going on to better understand this, we do know that wildfire risk is increasing in Western Washington, and it's due to a few conditions that are changing in our environment. One of those is increasing air temperatures. The other one is less rain in the summer, and then earlier snow melt. And those combined result in basically drier fuels or drier forests. And so basically what we're saying is we know that the conditions are more ripe for wildfire. So it is an important time to start thinking about, as a resident and as communities living in a wildland urban interface areas, to be thinking about this stuff as we move forward. So there are three basic potential ignition sources when it comes to wildfire. There's a surface fire, which, as you can imagine, is fire moving across the surface of the ground. It's burning things in its path that are flammable, and it will keep moving, especially if there's a wind behind it, until it hits something that is not flammable and the flames or the embers die down. The other one is a crown fire, which isn't something we necessarily see around here. That's extreme conditions where fire is actually moving across the canopy of the trees. And then there are blowing embers, and embers are actually the #1 cause of home ignition in a wildfire. So a lot of what I'm talking about in this presentation and when I talk to homeowners is really focused on embers and protection from embers. So I'm going to close my blinds here really quick. I've got weird lights shining on my face. So embers are basically pieces of burning material that get picked up by the wind, and they can, blow up to a mile ahead of the main fire and start spot fires in other places. But they also are things that get lodged in small cracks and crevices around homes and decks, come blow in through vents into homes, things like that. So they really can cause a lot of damage. Okay, so one thing that I really like to focus on when I'm talking to residents about how to reduce the risk to their property is this focus on the home ignition zone. And the home ignition zone is this concept that came out of research on how homes are burning down in wildfires, because you would see, these news clips and these aerial photos in California of a wildfire that's moved through, and you can see all the damage in the blackened landscape. And then you have, 4 homes in a neighborhood that survived. And it's like, okay, well, what is it about those homes that is allowing them to survive a massive wildfire? So a lot of studies and research were done around that to come out with this concept that there is this zone around structures where you can have the most effective influence on whether your property will survive a wildfire, and that is called the home ignition zone. So it's the condition of the home itself or any structures on the property and everything around it out to 100 feet. And sometimes if you are on a sloped property, it can be more than 100 feet. It can be more like 200 feet, just kind of depends on the specifics of your property. But that home ignition zone is really the zone that I'm focused on when I am working with homeowners in how to reduce their wildfire risk. So when I start talking about some of the specifics of what you can do to your structures and your landscaping to reduce that risk, it really is, it might seem like nitpicky things, but it really is the little things that can make the biggest difference in whether your home will survive. So modifications to the construction of your home and the vegetation around your home can really make a big difference on the survivability of your structures. And this is, a lot of this is focused on the idea that in the worst case scenario, you and your family have been evacuated and the resources are strapped and there's not enough firefighters to defend every single home. Will your home survive on its own? And that's kind of what we're aiming for in these types of activities. So I always start at the roof and I work down and out to the landscaping and the more natural areas of the properties. So starting at the roof, it is the most exposed, largest surface area of your structures. And so it can make a big difference on whether your home survives a wildfire. So a Class A fire rated roofing is going to provide the best protection for your home. Metal and composition shingle are both very good fire resistant materials to have on your roof. Untreated shake roofs are extremely flammable. There's not as many of those as we used to see around, but there still are some out there. And I think the most important thing really about the roof is maintenance. It's important to make sure your roof is in good condition and that it's clear of flammable debris that tends to collect on it. So tree branches, pine needles, leaves. These things tend to collect in areas where differing roof line angles meet in those valleys, and of course in gutters. And so it's really important to get that stuff cleaned out of your gutters and off of your roof because it just traps embers and it's a very flammable light fuels that are easy to ignite and then can carry fire to your roof. So siding and windows. This picture here is showing I don't know how to describe it, a sort of research warehouse station. It's the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and they get to do all this cool experiments where they get to burn stuff. And anyway, so they built this house, and half of it is built with wood shake siding and pine needles all around, and the other side is built with fire resistant materials like hardy plank siding and gravel right up to the house. And then they blow, a bunch of embers at the structure to see, what will happen. And of course, the side that is built with fire resistant materials, it has not ignited, and the other side has. So, so when we're looking at siding, the type of siding makes a difference. So the fiber cement, like hardy plank type siding, can be much more fire resistant than something like wood. But the other really important thing about siding is, on your house, is what is around it, immediately around your house. And I'm going to talk more about that, but the relationship between what's right up next to your house and your house itself can really make a difference in whether a fire is able to carry to your structure. As far as windows go, double pane tempered glass windows will withstand a lot more heat and won't crack like a single pane window, which could crack and then leave the inside of your home exposed. As far as skylights go, you want to avoid the plastic bubble skylights because plastic will melt. Glass is much better. And again, because it's on the roof, you're just thinking about the maintenance issue, making sure that any debris is cleaned off the top of that, and any of the edges are have metal flashing around them and are not lifting up, and everything's in good shape. Vents. So vents, looking at vents on a home, this is one of the most common usually easy, inexpensive fixes you can do on your structure to help protect it from embers. A lot of times gable vents or foundation vents or other types of vents don't have any screening on them, or they have screening that has holes that are large enough to let embers in that can do damage. So the recommendation for vent screening is 1/8 of an inch metal mesh. A lot of times especially on the foundation vents, I think the standard is to use a 1/4 inch metal mesh, but 1/8 of an inch is what is recommended to keep out embers that are big enough to do damage. So checking all of your vents on your house and making sure that they're screened properly can go a long way in protecting it from igniting. The other thing is, especially with the foundation vents that are inset, you can see in this picture, there's mulch and dead leaves that have accumulated in there. Raking that stuff back and cleaning that out can also help. I will say that I do not recommend screening dryer vents. As far as dryer vents go, what you want to look at is either the hood on the vent or the cover on the vent should be metal, and that's actually the same recommendation for really any vent outlet. It should be metal instead of plastic or wood. Decks and porches and fences. I should have put fences on here, but I didn't. Anything that's attached to the house can carry fire to it. So the really important thing about decks is not to store anything flammable underneath them. It is very common for people to store wood scraps and firewood and things like that under their decks because it's a little bit drier and it's out of the way and you don't see it as much. But doing that, just basically you're building a campfire, building kindling underneath your deck. So if embers or flame get in there and that stuff ignites, it's right underneath your deck. It can ignite your deck and carry to your home. So the area underneath the deck should be a non-flammable zone, or if your deck isn't very far off the ground, sometimes people will enclose the underside of their deck with some non-flammable materials, whether it's the 1/8" screening or metal sheeting. It just kind of depends on your aesthetic preferences on how you do that and the height that your deck is built at. So the other thing that's important about decks is the surface of the deck. The same place that debris tends to accumulate on your deck, in the cracks where the deck meets the siding or in corners, is the same place the embers will end up collecting when it's windy and their landing places. And that stuff is really flammable, as I mentioned before when I was talking about the gutters. So if you could imagine embers landing in the dry debris like you see in this middle picture with twigs and leaves and pine cones and whatever else is in there, that will easily ignite, and that will smolder and potentially ignite the deck and ignite the siding. So things like installing metal flashing at those intersections can really make a difference, and just regular maintenance and cleaning off of your decks to get rid of that flammable stuff is important. The other thing I don't have on this slide that I didn't mention is anything that's on the deck that's flammable, whether like deck furniture, if it's plastic or cushions and things like that. If you are leaving town during sort of the height of wildfire season potential, which around here is like, July 4th, usually through September. If you're going out of town for an extended period of time, it is a good idea to bring that stuff inside, because that can also help spread fire. The picture on the right is just an example of what some homeowners have done underneath their deck to make a non-flammable zone. They put gravel under there. They don't need to enclose it. So if embers land in that gravel, it's not going to be able to ignite anything. So as I mentioned earlier about the siding material and the relationship between what's right up next to your house and your house, this is a really vulnerable zone as far as fire being able to carry to your structure. So because anything that's right up against your house that might be flammable could potentially carry fire to your structure. So really you want that first, I say 3 to 5 feet in my slide, but ideally it's a 5-foot zone to be a non-flammable zone. So whether it's bare dirt or gravel or stepping stones or something that's non-flammable in that zone, that's what you want to have around that immediate perimeter of your structure to help reduce the ability for fire to carry to the structure. Again, if you have a scenario like this picture on the right here, where you can see the massive accumulation of dead leaves and other things collecting on the roof, raking all that stuff back, getting rid of that, moving it outside that zone is really important. That I think what I usually tell people is if you are going to do, if you feel overwhelmed with all of the things that you should or could do, I say start at the structure and then work out to the first 5 feet. Those are the most important areas to prioritize when you are trying to protect your structure from wildfire. So mulch, I want to just acknowledge mulch because it is really great for so many reasons, and we love to use it in our gardens and in our planted areas because it does offer a lot of benefits. However, it is combustible. So my tips for mulch are, again, you can use it, but put it outside that 5-foot zone, the 5-foot non-flammable zone. Avoid mulch like shredded Western red cedar. That tends to be a lot more flammable. And then, choosing rock mulch in that first 5 feet and organic mulch outside of that is one option that you can use. This picture is one I stole off the internet, but it was a home that had mulch right up against the house that ignited. I don't know the cause of the ignition, but it ignited and then caught some, I think, probably like arborvitae type trees that were right up against the house on fire, and it just completely damaged this home. So, if you can avoid having mulch right up next to your house, that's a good thing. Propane tanks. So as far as propane tanks go, there's there's sort of some differing recommendations about how far away a propane tank should be to your house for wildfire safety. I think the common recommendation I see is 30 feet away, but that's, I feel like in places I've been, that is kind of rarely the case. But people don't like to see their propane tanks. They like to hide them. And so often what I see is, you know, a bunch of plants and vegetation growing up around them to hide the propane tank, or, you know, like a wood fence around it or something. And I get that. But the issue with propane tanks is that they're designed to off gas under intense heat and pressure. And so if you have vegetation right up next to it that is with flames in it, and then you have that added fumes or gas coming out of there, then you have a more volatile situation. So really with a propane tank, you should have a good 5 to 10 feet of clearance around it and underneath it. You can put some rock under there, but the less vegetation you have around it, the better. These pictures are just an example of what you could do to make your propane tank more fun and interesting if you can't hide it. I think I would choose the yellow submarine if I was going to do one. So moving on to the fire resistant landscaping piece. So there is this idea that in order to have a fire resistant property, your landscape has to look like the surface of the moon. And it does not, especially in Western Washington, where everything grows and we're very green, and most of us like that. This isn't a reality for us, and it doesn't have to be. So you don't have to have a landscape that looks like the surface of the moon to have a fire resistant landscape. You can have a lot more green and balance in that than what you might think. So there's some important concepts associated with having a fire resistant landscape. And the main one is really just to break up that fuel continuity across the surface of your landscape to your structures. So whether it's planting in clusters or incorporating rock features or rock pathways or water features, even lawn in small patches can work great as a fuel break. It just helps break up the ability for fire to gain intensity and carry to your structure. So we're just trying to break up that space. As far as lawn goes, I know in the summertime, watering your lawn isn't necessarily the best conservation practice. So it doesn't necessarily have to be green, but if it's short, it can really act as a good fuel break because it's not going to allow for large flame lengths, and something will probably just smolder or go out in very short lawn, so maximum 4 inches height. The other important thing to think about, aside from breaking up the fuel continuity across the surface, is also to break up the fuel continuity vertically. So we aren't necessarily looking to exclude fire from our landscapes. What we want to do is keep it manageable and low intensity, and we can help do that by reducing the ability for fire to carry up into larger trees, particularly conifer trees that we know are more flammable. So we have this concept called ladder fuels, which is essentially continuous fuel from the ground up into larger trees. So maybe it's, tall grass to a blackberry patch to a cedar tree with low hanging branches. And you've just got this continuous fuel that a fire can climb. So what we want to do within the home ignition zone is reduce those ladder fuels. So sometimes that is pruning trees, 6 to 15 feet up off the ground. Sometimes it's removing the underbrush, just kind of depending on the situation. Probably a good scenario where you might remove the underbrush versus pruning the tree is if you have a bunch of blackberries or other invasive stuff that you don't want growing up underneath that, you might choose to clean that up instead of pruning your tree limbs up. We do have on the Skagit and Whatcom Conservation District wildfire pages on our website, we do have a conifer pruning guide on there that you can download and review if you are trying to do some pruning, but you're not sure the best way to do that. There's some guidance on that too. Okay, the other thing, I'm with the Conservation District, so I'm often focused on native plants, and we have a native plant sale every year. So we do a lot of promotion of native plants for landscaping. And native plants, just because they are adapted to our environment, tend to be pretty fire resistant, and they tend to thrive, and a thriving plant tends to be less flammable. So consider using native plants in your landscaping. But as far as fire resistant plants go, it's a little bit subjective. There is a fire resistant plants book also available on our website, which has been very well received by homeowners that I've worked with. It's a very nice color guide. It tells you all about the conditions that the plant needs and whether it attracts pollinators and is deer resistant and all this great stuff. However, there are some plants in there that certain people would say, I don't know if that's really a fire resistant plant. So there's some subjectivity to whether a plant is fire resistant or not. And a lot of that has to do with the condition of the plant itself. Because you can have a plant that might be listed as fire resistant that is suffering from drought, and it's dry, and it's, it makes it much more flammable. So that said, fire resistant plants do have certain characteristics, including they tend to have higher moisture content in their leaves. They have less buildup of dead vegetation in them. They tend to be more drought resistant, and they also tend to have a more low compact growth form. So this table on the right is just kind of a scale of more fire resistant type plants to less fire resistant type plants. And you'll see, succulents and ground covers at the top. And then as you go down, the less fire resistant, more flammable plants are the grasses and the conifers. So as far as flammable plants go, I thought it would be good to point out some of our common landscape plants that we see around here that are very flammable, and then some other ones that we also annoyingly grow on our properties that we might not choose to have there, but are there. So flammable plants tend to be water stressed. They accumulate a lot of dead, dry material, and they also have a high oil or resin content. So a really good example of a really common landscape plant that's highly flammable is juniper. Even if they make great gin, they are very flammable. And then arborvitae is another one. This is a very common plant to see, that people put in between them and their neighbors because it makes a great view screen, and they grow really fast, but they are very flammable. And then of course our annoying invasive plants like Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberries. Scotch broom has a high oil content. They're very flammable, and blackberries, especially older growth blackberries that just have tons of dead canes in the center of them, are also really flammable plants. So moving beyond the landscaped area, we're still kind of talking about within that home ignition zone. And I realize in a number of cases, when you're talking about 30 plus feet or whatever, you're on your neighbor's property or you're on a neighboring property by then. So there is a lot of value in working with your neighbors on reducing risk, because it is a shared risk. But assuming that you have some space on your property, and we're talking about more of a natural area beyond the areas that you're maintaining your landscape, what you want to avoid, if you're still within that home ignition zone, is accumulation of heavy accumulations of dead plant material, blow down from windstorms, or slash piles like shown in this picture on the far left. Those are highly flammable. They really increase the intensity of a fire, and you don't want to have that within your home ignition zone. Beyond that, out in farther away, it's okay. They're great habitat. They can be great habitat piles. So there is some benefits to those. You just don't, as far as wildfire is concerned, you don't want to have those within your home ignition zone. Of course, managing those invasive species, as I talked about on the last slide. And then in the areas, in your forested areas, and Nick talked a little bit about this too, sometimes you're going to have a situation where you've got stressed trees, unhealthy trees, diseased trees that you need to take out. or trees that just aren't going to be able to compete with your larger, healthier trees. And so thinning those out can sometimes be a practice that you would employ on your property, especially if they're standing dead and they have a lot of dead branches still left on them, creating that ladder fuel situation. Removing those trees are okay. And then, you know, sometimes there's a risk of them falling near trails or recreation areas or on roads. So there can be a number of reasons why you would want to do some thinning, but it also is beneficial for reducing wildfire risk. So some quick other considerations on forested properties is, you know, we don't have, Western Washington is different than Eastern Washington, and large scale, landscape scale thinning projects aren't necessarily always the right answer in Western Washington. And so we want to be able to keep some of that canopy cover to provide shade, which also helps reduce those soil temperatures and retain that soil moisture so our plants are less flammable and less dry. And so that is one consideration to think about. Another one is for tactical purposes, which is incorporating pathways on your property or forested landscapes that can be used by firefighters if they're trying to access or trying to manage a wildfire, so they can lay hose to more easily battle that fire. Okay, so that I'm pretty much done with my presentation, but I do want to talk about some of the resources that are available through the conservation districts, Skagit and Whatcom. And actually, if you happen to be from another county, there are wildfire education programs in some of our other counties at our other conservation districts. But we do offer a lot of free resources for residents that they can take advantage of. One of those that I have found has been really valuable to people is a wildfire risk assessment. So that's where I would come out to your property, we would walk your property together, we would assess the risk to your structures, and I would provide a report that includes specifics on how to reduce wildfire risk to your property. The other one is I work, well, I should say, not just me, but me and our other staff, including Nick, who you heard from earlier. We work with communities to go through the Firewise USA program. That is a national recognition program that provides a framework for communities to better understand their wildfire risk and then do something about it. And as part of that program, there are some perks associated with that. A lot of times we being the conservation district, are able to work in close partnership with Department of Natural Resources to help the community implement, you know, a fuels reduction or a chipping project. We've done 3 of those over the last month and have a couple more planned in communities around Skagit and Whatcom counties. So there's a lot of great things that come out of participating in the Firewise program and really working with your neighbors to address the shared risk that you have. The other thing we're available for is presentations like we're doing tonight, and outreach events that happen in communities or through organizations. We have a lot of resources we can share. And then at Skagit Conservation District, you just heard from Nick Kunz. He is our forester, and he and I go out together quite a bit, and he has the forest health expertise and can do forest health assessments and write forest plans with landowners. We don't currently have that resource in Whatcom County, but I know DNR does have stewardship foresters that can provide a similar service. So, and then if you want more information, our website is at the bottom there. That's the Skagit CD website, and I have the Whatcom CD website on the next slide. But we have wildfire pages that have a lot of information and resources that you can scroll through and click on. And you can also schedule a risk assessment through the website by clicking on the schedule button. And that is it from me. There's the Whatcom CD website on there if you need that. And it sounds like I think we're going to open it up for some questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was a great presentation and really great information. It looks like our first question here would be for you, and that's, would the home ignition zone be smaller here in Skagit County, considering the 100-foot buffer sounds like it was generalized for California conditions?
You know, that's a great question. I actually don't have a good answer for that. There hasn't been any other science and research that I know of that has said in our Northwest area, we should have smaller home ignition zones. I don't know if Kirk has any perspective or any more information on that than I do. But right now, there isn't any other available information. But that's a really good question and something that I actually came to my mind very recently. And I thought, well, I should look into that. But you know, that's kind of a new concept. But that's a great question. Kirk, do you have any insight on that?
Well, maybe. I think, yeah, I could absolutely see why conventional wisdom would take you there. I think, like Jenny said, we don't have any science to sort of back up that intuition. I think it's possible that you could reduce your home ignition zone, and often people have to anyway, because for many of us, 100 feet would put you on your neighbor's property. But you know, it's embers, which, as we've discussed, are kind of the main cause of structure loss, can travel a long ways. 100 feet is not a long distance for an ember to make it if it's windy. So it's still good practice, even in Western Washington.
Great, thank you too. Some other questions we got when folks signed up. There was a question about whether there are any plans to address the issue of housing in unsafe areas, for example, areas with high wildfire risk in Skagit or Whatcom counties.
So I can take that one. I actually have just been having conversations with the Skagit County planning folks, and there is a statewide code called the WUI code. WUI, it stands for Wildland Urban Interface, and Skagit County has adopted that code. They're getting ready to put out some landowner friendly tools to be able to better understand that code, but it's not focused on trying to get people to not build in those areas. It's more focused on requiring certain safety measures if you're going to build in those areas. So things like defensible space and fire resistant construction, and it's all kind of balanced on fuel types and other factors. I'm not going to go into specific details because it isn't my area of expertise, but if you want more information on that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll connect you to somebody at the county who can share some more specifics on that Wildland Urban Interface code for new buildings and retrofit buildings in the Wildland Urban Interface.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Another question that came up was, how prepared are volunteer firefighters in South Bellingham, for example, for a wildfire? And what procedures would they use to protect our neighborhood should we be at risk? So this might be one for Kirk.
Well, I can actually,
Yep, please.
I can answer part of that too, because I work with the South Whatcom Fire Authority pretty regularly. And I have the answer to this in a document only because I was working with the community in South Bellingham to do a community level risk assessment. And as part of that, I worked with the fire department to find out what their sort of response capabilities are if there is a wildfire. So I wrote this down. I'm going to read this just so you know, but if you have more questions, you should definitely reach out directly to the South Whatcom Fire Authority and you can ask them this directly. But in my document, I have written that the South Whatcom Fire Authority has one of each type 6, 5, 3, and 2 engines, which are all considered wildland engines or brush trucks. And they typically have about 6 to 7 red carded staff or volunteers that are trained to respond to wildfire. So beyond that, I don't know much more. I just know that is what they're equipped for. Kirk may be able to expound on that a little bit, but that is what I know.
Yeah, so the specific question was how prepared are volunteer firefighters in South Bellingham and what procedures would be in place, right? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty good answer. You know, every fire department trains for wildfire. At the moment, we're still bringing some of our seasonal staff on, but most of them are on now. So we have 4 engines in Whatcom County. And as far as the procedures, I mean, that, you know, we could talk all day and bore everyone probably with the nitty gritty details of that. But we do train with the county fire departments regularly. So when these situations arise, we can interface more or less seamlessly. And, you know, if there's ever fires where structures are threatened, a whole lot of people are going to come running. So.
Great. Thanks, Kirk and Jenny. Another question, you all touched on this a little bit, but I'll give you a chance to elaborate further. What are appropriate differences in wildfire risk mitigation between Western and Eastern Washington? Kind of a big question.
You say it one more time. What are appropriate differences in mitigation?
Yeah, what are appropriate differences in wildfire risk mitigation actions between Western and Eastern Washington?
That is, I mean, largely the concepts are the same, right? All of the Firewise concepts that Jenny discussed with, you know, how we build buildings and all that stuff is the same, really, regardless of where you are. We may take a different approach, you know. WUI or wildland urban interface areas are more common in Western Washington and they're more dense in Western Washington. So that poses some challenges that don't exist in Eastern Washington. So, you know, that can be a factor as well that, I don't know, seems counterintuitive maybe, but yeah, the concepts I would say really are largely the same.
Okay, thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, I'll just add on a little bit. So all of the things that we've discussed this evening in terms of actions that you can take, think of them as they're reducing risk. We can't completely eliminate risk. We could take all of these measures and still have issues or you know, loss of life and property. What we're really trying to do is reduce the risk. So in Western Washington, because folks have this perception that it doesn't happen here as frequently, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, right? And so part of what we're trying to do here is just help people realize that if something were to happen, it could be pretty severe. As I mentioned, we do have high severity. It's just infrequent. But if it does start, if the east winds start a blowing, you might need to get going. So again, it's just the context between East and West. People on the East side, they deal with it more frequently. They understand they've got to have a plan. They got to be able to basically leave quickly. On the West side, we're dealing with, as Kirk mentioned, a higher density of folks, and it's going to be really difficult to get people in and out of harm's way. So we're trying to get people wrapped around the concepts like we do with earthquakes or other natural disasters.
That's a great point, Nick. Thanks for sharing that. One more question just came in. I know we're a couple minutes over, so if folks need to take off, feel free. Otherwise, another question. When assessing risk to your property or structure, how does the presence of the Skagit River or Highway 20 in between you and forest land affect that risk?
It's definitely a positive. So any major barrier, fuel break is a good thing. So, you know, a highway is great. You know, highway is 30, 40 feet across. That's a big chunk. I mean, we use highways as anchor points on wildfires all the time. And the Skagit River is even better. So is it impossible that a fire could jump those barriers? No, not by any stretch. In the right conditions, it absolutely could. But it's still better than not having them there at all. I mean, those are good barriers. It's a good starting point.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirk. I think that's about it for questions. Real quickly, I want to share one last thing with you all who are still here. As Jenny mentioned, the Conservation District will do in-person site assessments where they'll go to a property and assess wildfire risk there and kind of talk through some specific actions that landowners can take to reduce that risk. The Land Trust is hosting a couple of these site visits with Jenny and Nick, one in the eastern half of the county near Marble Mount and one in the western half of the county near Mount Vernon. You can see the dates and times up on the screen here. And anyone's welcome to attend those. They're both going to be hosted on Skagit Land Trust conservation easements. So our stewardship director, Regina Wandler, will be there as well to talk a little bit more about how those wildfire risk reduction measures are balanced with protecting the conservation features and how those are defined in the easements. So yeah, and I'll be sure to send those links out along with the resource sheet that kind of talks about some of the resources that Jenny and Nick shared today, as well as the recording link. So with that, thanks everyone for coming, and a big thank you to our presenters for all your really informative talks and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Great job, Jonathan. That was awesome.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks for coming. I appreciate
Sure.
it.
Anytime. See you later.
Bye.